You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we had a big day here. Republicans held yet another hearing to try and shoehorn the weaponization of government narrative into the political ecosystem. But you actually appeared at this hearing this morning, and you and Democrats had what I think is a pretty brilliant strategy while you were handed a platform by Republicans who are in the majority to actually exploit an opening here. So talk about what you did.
Yeah, so surprisingly, I was invited to appear before Congress, specifically before Chairman Jim Jordan's subcommittee on the weaponization of government. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, it wasn't Chairman Jordan who invited me. It was the ranking Democrat member, Representative Stacey Plaskett. Now, because it is the Republicans in control of the House, the Republicans got to call 3 witnesses. The Dems got to call 1, just me. And the 3 witnesses were talking about, whistleblowers and how the FBI was running roughshod over whistleblowers who were, exposing how the FBI was out to get Donald Trump, which of course is pure and utter nonsense. But that was sort of the topic of the day. But I was asked to talk about the weaponization of government that is... But I was asked to talk about not whistleblowers, but Project 2025, which is Donald Trump and the Republicans' blueprint for autocracy, 900-plus page tome that talks about how they can basically disassemble government. My piece of the testimony involved how they were going to disassemble the Department of Justice. And here is the plan in a nutshell. People may have heard of this thing called Schedule F. Well, Schedule F is basically Project 2025's plan to get rid of thousands and thousands of civil servants and public servants, apolitical government employees like myself. For 3 decades, we weren't political appointees. We were there, we didn't care one whit about politics. We were there to do the business of the American people. We are America's law firm, the prosecutors at the Department of Justice. Well, what Project 2025 wants to do is kind of get rid of thousands of those, good career civil servants who do everything apolitically and put in a whole bunch of Donald Trump appointees, loyalists, lapdogs, sycophants, so that they can pledge their loyalty to Donald Trump, not the Constitution, and they can do Donald Trump's dirty, corrupt, and indeed criminal bidding. So in a very real sense, Project 2025 proposes to consolidate all of the powers of the Department of Justice in Donald Trump and make him investigator, prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner. What could possibly go wrong, right? So I got to talk about that, what Project 2025 really means. And what it means is the rule of law will no longer be applied without fear or favor. It will be applied according to Donald Trump's whims. It will be used to reward his loyalists, his allies, and his criminal associates, and it will be used to punish his perceived enemies. That is Project 2025.
There was something so striking about your opening statement where I think you explained it so concisely and perfectly, basically, where you explained what the difference would look like, for example, if when we inevitably get these claims of fraud, if Donald Trump is in office, can you explain real quick what it would look like, for example, if there was fraud that benefited Donald Trump versus fraud that disadvantaged Donald Trump?
Yeah, and I talked about that, Brian, against the backdrop of the preview that we've had of how Donald Trump will abuse and has abused the power of government and the power of the Department of Justice. Remember when all of his government officials were telling him that there was no systemic fraud undermining the results of the 2020 election?
Bill Barr called it bullshit. Bill Barr himself said it was bullshit.
Exactly. And what did Donald Trump say? I don't care. It doesn't matter that there was no fraud. Just say there was and leave the rest to me and my Republican allies in Congress. And Brian, that is a quote from a Donald Trump DOJ official who provided that testimony. Okay, against that backdrop, what would a Donald Trump-centric Department of Justice look like under Project 2025? Well, with all of his loyalists, lapdogs, flunkies, and sycophants in place, let's talk about the midterm elections, the first midterm elections after he gets elected, which he won't, but indulge me the hypothetical. So let's assume that there are reports of potential voter fraud in the 2026 midterm elections. Donald Trump's flunkies at the Department of Justice would basically ask one question when they were deciding what to do with those reports of potential voter fraud. Does the voter fraud help Republicans or does it hurt Republicans? If it helps Republicans, we will not investigate it. They'll just say, well, insufficient evidence. They'll push it aside. Why? Because the fraud helps Republicans and by extension helps Donald Trump. What about if the alleged fraud hurts Republicans? Then they're going to go after it with both guns drawn, regardless of whether there's enough evidence to investigate it or not. This is not the equal application of the law. This is autocracy.
Right. Perfectly put. Glenn, I live streamed the whole thing. And by the way, for those who want to watch the hearing, I'll embed the link right here on the screen. I'll also post it in the post description of this video. But what I noticed was that Republicans largely avoided talking to you and instead focused solely on the three witnesses that they themselves invited. Why do you think that was?
Well, I was surprised. I was waiting for Jim Jordan and Matt Gaetz and these other characters to start yelling at me. And
people who talk a big game, right?
Yeah, calling me names and disagreeing. How about pushing back? Because if people watch my 5-minute opening statement, I went after Donald Trump and Project 2025 about as hard as I could. I crammed everything in that I could in 5 minutes to highlight the danger to democracy that is Project 2025. And then I'm waiting and I'm waiting and I'm waiting. And I get virtually no questions from the Republican members of Congress. Now, in fairness, it is a Republican-controlled House and committee. So they got 3 witnesses, and the Dems only got 1, me. So it's not surprising that most of the questions I got came from the Democrat members of the committee. But still, I thought the Republicans would want to push back a little bit on what I was saying about Trump and Project 2025. But, I think the reason, really, that they didn't ask me questions is not because they disagree with, the Donald Trump's blueprint for autocracy, Project 2025. I think it's because they know that Project 2025 is polling so low in the court of public opinion. I mean, it's polling lower than whale shit, okay? Excuse me, but that's just how low it's polling. And so I think it was a political calculation. They were afraid to touch it for fear of political blowback, so they wouldn't ask me anything. But listen, bravery, thy name is not the Republican Party.
Right. By the way, the actual number of how popular Project 2025 is, according to a new NBC poll, 4%. I would imagine hemorrhoids would poll higher than 4% in this country. 4%. So to your exact point, that is why they avoided talking to you. It's because they know that their own agenda, their own professed agenda written by people, 200 of which were in Donald Trump's own first administration, is that toxic that they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. They're happy to enact it if they're able to consolidate power for themselves, but God forbid they actually acknowledge that they're backing any of the policies that are written for them to enact. And let's finish off with this. I should note that Jim Jordan actually did question you just for but a fleeting moment at the very end of the hearing with just some leading questions. What did you make of the fact that the only time a Republican deigned to address you was just some quick, pointless questions to confirm his prior beliefs?
Maybe unsurprising, but a little disappointing. I'm a fighter. I'm a gutter kid from Jersey. I played football, I wrestled, I boxed, I served in the Army, I prosecuted homicide cases and RICO cases. I don't mind mixing it up. And I was kind of ready for the challenge of the Jim Jordans and the Matt Gaetz, but they opted really not to ask me anything. And it was funny, at the tail end, after a 2.5-hour hearing, all of the other members of the committee were gone, and it was just Jim Jordan wrapping up. And he's like, Mr. Kershaw, let me ask you a couple questions. And he, kind of yammered out a couple of questions that were leading questions, and I answered them honestly and in a straightforward way. And I almost was inclined to say, is that really all you've got for me? But the answer is, yeah, that's really all he had.
Right. I mean, look, we already know that Republicans love to stay in their cocoon. It is why they don't come on any other media other than right-wing media. This is their Fox News Newsmax approach, and they just want to talk amongst themselves in their hermetically sealed bubble to continue to perpetuate lies and disinformation to the American people, knowing full well that they won't get any pushback. And if they dared speak to you and risk having you, just acknowledge objective reality and poke a hole in one of these lies, then I think that wouldn't have served them very well. So it's certainly not exactly the most brave approach you could have taken. But Glenn, as for you, thank you for the work that you did on that committee. A lot of people watched that live stream along with me this morning, and glad that we have you speaking on our behalf here. So with that said, for those watching right now, if you want to support the work that we do and in this series, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.